read anymore?
Yeah,
I don't.
I assume you're referencing that to me. No, I don't. But as you know, I've like pretty much backed off of those things recently. It's too much work at this point. So definitely not.
Yeah, I speed scan. That's like my reading mode these days. So I try to read as fast as possible and as much as I can.
Do any of you believe in reading deeply anymore? Do you have time to read deeply anymore?
My version of reading deeply was like a Google News reader for the last year or so, but that's I can't even keep up with that anymore. So.
Well, what do you mean deep reading? You mean like close reading, or?
No, you're a PhD student. There are 2 PhD students in the room, right? I mean, not in the room. There are many PhD students.
Right,
Two on the panel.
and we read very, very
you read
fast.
very
That's
fast
what we do.
and very closely.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, the PhD model is not deep reading, I think, in the sense you're talking about it. It's just you cover a shitload of material in a very rapid amount of, in a very sort of short amount of time.
Or you pretend.
Basically, PhDs teach you how to skim. I mean, that's sort of the model of content. And so especially, I mean, if we are supposed to be the hardcore audience for things like, you know, Grey Room, Log, etc., and we don't read those things, then who the hell else is
Ooh. Well, a couple of years ago, when a reporter visited Google's facility and asked who they're scanning all the books for, Google let slip artificial intelligences. And the reporter asked, who's going to read these books? And they said artificial intelligence. They soon backed off on this. Is this the future? Will Google be reading Grey Room? Will Google be reading Log? Will they be reading my books? Is that we'll have an audience of one?
Right. It'll be tagged and it'll be sort of filed away. Your books will be read, tagged, filed away, and then searchable for no one to actually find them except for that one citation that you'll need to make in your thesis.
I think you've already aptly described my condition. Okay, so another question is the iPad. We've heard from at the beginning of last year, I went to a symposium, and Nicholas Lehman was the dean of the Columbia School of Journalism. Began it by asking if the university shouldn't buy the New York Times. He said philosophy departments are useless, but universities support them, and the New York Times is similarly useless, but we think that, like philosophy departments, there's a greater good. The New York Times has a certain purpose in this world. And he said, maybe universities will buy it, perhaps thinking soon Columbia School of Journalism would have as a school, or Columbia's school newspaper would be the New York Times. But it seems like we've backed off from that, and all of the talk recently has been that the iPad is going to save things. Maybe you brought up the iPad. What about the iPad?
I think the iPad is interesting from sort of what it sparked last week on all of the social networks and on Twitter, not necessarily for what it is, because no one, maybe 24 people have really played with one, but the fact that it could create such a social buzz that people could say it's iTampon, it's iPad, it's that it has a presence in sort of the lexicon without actually being an existing object is interesting. As it functions, people are already wanting more from it. You mentioned, video, and then you mentioned iPad, and the iPad doesn't have video, so that's already sort of a problem with it. And people,
It'll play video.
It'll play video, but it doesn't video yet.
David, as a designer, what do you think of the iPad? Have you looked into it as a designer? Where are you going to be designing books for it?
Not particularly. And I think it was probably misunderstood when I responded a minute ago.